The night shift at Blackwater Container Terminal was usually the quietest part of the day. By midnight, most cargo ships had already been unloaded. The cranes slowed down. Forklifts carried the last rows of containers into place. And inside the security office, one man watched over nearly 100 live security cameras. His name was Gavin. He had worked security for almost 12 years. People often joked that he knew the terminal better than anyone else. Not because he walked every corner, but because he watched every corner. Every camera had a number. Every lane had a name. Every blind spot had been measured years ago. Nothing surprised him anymore. Most nights were painfully ordinary. Someone forgot a gate. A truck entered the wrong lane. A forklift driver took a shortcut. That was usually the biggest excitement of the shift. Just after 1 a.m., Gavin noticed forklift 12 leaving warehouse C. The operator was an experienced employee named Eric. Eric had worked there for nearly 8 years. Gavin had seen him on these cameras thousands of times. Everything looked perfectly normal. Eric drove between 2 long rows of stacked containers. Camera 26 followed him, then camera 27. Gavin watched without thinking. Forklift 12 stopped. Eric climbed out. That was unusual. Drivers almost never left their forklifts inside the storage lanes unless something blocked the path. Gavin leaned closer to the monitor. Eric looked down the narrow lane. He didn't seem frightened. He didn't run. He simply stood still, as if he had noticed something. After several seconds, he slowly walked toward the end of camera 27's view. Gavin expected him to appear on camera 28. He didn't. Gavin waited. 5 seconds. Nothing. 10 seconds. Still nothing. He frowned. Sometimes operators accidentally selected the wrong camera. He switched back. Camera 27. Eric walked away. Camera 28. Empty. He checked camera 29. Nothing. Camera 30. Nothing. Gavin replayed the recording. Eric stepped forward, reached the edge of camera 27, and disappeared beyond the containers, exactly where he should have entered camera 28. He replayed it again. Same result. One more time. Nothing. He picked up the radio. Forklift 12, this is security. Silence. He tried again. Eric, radio check. Nothing. Gavin contacted the nearest patrol vehicle. Unit 3, can you check storage lane 27? Copy. The patrol cart arrived less than 3 minutes later. Gavin watched through another camera as 2 security officers stepped out. They reached the forklift. One officer climbed into the driver's seat. The engine was still running. The headlights were still on. The parking brake hadn't even been set. The second officer looked around the narrow corridor between the containers. Then his voice came over the radio. We've got the forklift. A short pause. But Eric isn't here. Gavin zoomed in. The driver's phone sat inside the cabin. His reflective jacket was hanging over the seat. Even his lunch cooler was still behind him. It looked as though he had only stepped away for a few seconds. The officer searched both ends of the lane. There was nowhere to hide. Solid steel containers stretched in every direction. No open doors, no vehicles leaving, no movement. Gavin opened the replay one last time, frame by frame. Eric stopped, turned his head slightly. Not toward camera 27, but toward something hidden beyond the corner. His posture changed. Not panic, not curiosity. Recognition. As though he had seen something waiting for him. The recording ended with Eric taking 3 slow steps. Crossing out of camera 27, and never appearing on another camera again. The search expanded within minutes. What had started as a missing employee report quickly became the highest priority incident on the terminal. Additional security officers arrived. Terminal management was notified. Every vehicle entering or leaving the port was stopped and inspected. No one was allowed to leave until Eric was found. Gavin continued reviewing every available camera, not just camera 27 and camera 28, but every camera connected to the storage yard. He followed every possible route, every service road, every emergency exit, every fence line. Nothing. It was as though Eric had simply ceased to exist after leaving camera 27. Outside, the search teams moved carefully between the towering rows of containers. Each lane stretched hundreds of feet before disappearing into another maze of steel. Powerful floodlights illuminated the main roads, but between the stacks, deep shadows remained. The forklift hadn't moved. Its engine had finally been switched off. Everything inside was exactly where it should have been. His wallet, his phone, his gloves. Even the coffee in the cup holder was still warm. One of the officers looked around the narrow corridor. "I don't understand." He couldn't have gone far. No one answered, because everyone was thinking the same thing. There was nowhere to go. The outer fence stood nearly 15 feet high. Every vehicle gate was monitored. Every truck entering the terminal had been logged. If someone had left, someone would have seen it. Yet no one had. Nearly an hour passed. The search produced nothing. No footprints, no blood, no torn clothing, no signs of a struggle. Only silence. Back inside the security office, Gavin requested archived footage from the previous 6 months. At first, he wasn't looking for another disappearance. He was looking for camera failures. If camera 27 had developed an intermittent fault, someone in maintenance should have reported it. Instead, he found something stranger. Camera 27 had never malfunctioned. Not once. Its recordings were flawless. But several incident reports mentioned employees briefly losing contact with one another near the same storage lanes. A forklift mechanic who became disoriented for almost 20 minutes. A contractor who reported hearing someone walking behind him even though the lane was empty. Another worker who insisted he had seen movement between 2 container rows before realizing no one else was there. Every report had been dismissed. Fatigue, stress, night shift hallucinations, nothing worth investigating. Gavin printed the reports anyway. The similarities bothered him. A terminal supervisor entered the control room. "Anything?" Gavin shook his head. "No cameras show him leaving." The supervisor stared at camera 27 for several seconds, then quietly asked, "Can you play it again?" Gavin replayed the footage. Eric stopped, looked ahead, then disappeared beyond the edge of the frame. The supervisor didn't say anything. He simply watched it a second time, then a third. Finally, he pointed at the monitor. "Pause." Gavin froze the image. "What?" The supervisor leaned closer. "Zoom in." The picture became grainy. Container walls, concrete, forklift lights. Nothing unusual. Then the supervisor spoke again. "Lower right corner." Gavin adjusted the image. There, barely visible against the darkness, were several long scrape marks running across the side of a container. Fresh, bright silver beneath the paint, as though something incredibly heavy had been dragged across solid steel. The marks hadn't been there earlier that evening. One of the search teams was immediately sent back to inspect the location. Less than 5 minutes later, their radio came alive. We found the scratches. A pause. They're deeper than we thought. Another pause. They continue around the corner. Gavin reached for another camera overlooking the adjacent lane. Nothing moved. The officer slowly disappeared from view, following the trail of fresh marks between the containers. A few seconds later, one of the radios crackled again. His voice sounded confused. "Control!" Another burst of static. "We've got something." The transmission stopped. Not with a scream, not with panic. It simply ended. For several long seconds, no one inside the control room spoke. Every radio channel remained silent. Gavin immediately switched to the cameras overlooking the adjacent storage lanes. Camera 31. Nothing. Camera 32. Empty. Camera 33. Only endless rows of steel containers. Then, the radio came back to life. "We're okay." The officer sounded shaken. "We lost signal for a second." Everyone inside the control room exhaled. "What happened?" A pause. "I don't know." Another pause. The scratches continue. Gavin watched as the two officers slowly returned into camera 31. Neither of them was injured, but both men kept looking over their shoulders. One of them asked permission to leave the search. His request surprised everyone. The officer had spent almost 15 years working port security. He had never abandoned an assignment before. The terminal supervisor denied the request. The search continued. By now, local police had arrived. The responding sergeant reviewed the camera footage himself. He reached exactly the same conclusion Gavin had. There's no way this man walked out of here. The police organized a systematic search. Each storage lane was assigned a 2-person team. No one would move alone. Every team reported their position every 60 seconds. For the next half hour, the operation became almost mechanical. Position, response, move, repeat. Nothing. Until Team 4 stopped responding. The dispatcher called again. No answer. Again. Silence. Their last reported location appeared only 2 lanes away from where Eric had vanished. Nearby officers reached the area within moments. Both members of Team 4 were still there, standing perfectly still. Neither of them had moved. "What happened?" one officer answered without taking his eyes off the darkness between the containers. "We heard something." "What?" "I don't know." It sounded, he hesitated, heavy. The second officer interrupted. "It wasn't walking toward us. It was walking beside us." No one understood what he meant. The area was searched immediately. Nothing was found. No damaged fences. No open containers. No hidden vehicles. Just more fresh scrape marks crossing another steel wall. The marks were now nearly shoulder high, deep enough to expose bare metal beneath the paint. Back in the control room, Gavin overlaid multiple camera feeds across the same timeline. He wasn't watching the missing workers anymore. He was watching the empty spaces between them, minute after minute. Nothing changed. Then he noticed it. Camera 31 captured 2 officers walking north. Camera 32 picked them up seconds later, but for less than a single second. Between those 2 recordings, a dark shape occupied the narrow gap separating the camera views. It wasn't clear enough to identify. There was no face, no eyes, no details. Only a massive silhouette, far taller than either officer. Gavin froze the frame. The terminal supervisor stared at the screen. "So that's what they've been seeing." The police sergeant looked at the image for several moments before speaking. "No." He pointed toward the officers. That's what they never saw. No one in the room argued, because every person looking at the monitor reached the same conclusion. Whatever had crossed that gap had done so without appearing on a single complete camera frame. The silence inside the control room was finally broken by another emergency call over the radio. "Control." The voice came from the southern storage yard. It was barely above a whisper. "We've lost another man." The room froze. This time, everyone knew it wasn't an accident. The southern storage yard was immediately locked down. No one entered without authorization. No one left alone. Every available officer, supervisor, and police unit gathered near the last reported position. The missing worker's flashlight was found first. It was still on. Lying beside one of the container rows, a portable radio was discovered several feet away. Its emergency button had been pressed. No one remembered hearing the alarm. The search continued until sunrise. Every container in the surrounding blocks was opened. Maintenance crews inspected drainage tunnels. Police searched the perimeter fence. Divers even checked the harbor along the terminal wall. Nothing. The missing worker had disappeared as completely as Eric. Hours later, investigators began reviewing decades of construction records for Blackwater Terminal. Old satellite photographs, engineering surveys, environmental assessments. One forgotten report caught their attention. Long before the terminal had been built, the entire eastern section of the property had been covered by a dense strip of coastal woodland. It stretched across the exact area now occupied by storage lanes 27 through 32. The forest had been cleared. The ground had been reinforced. Thousands of containers now stood where the trees had once grown. One investigator quietly looked at the old maps, then at the current layout. The long, narrow rows formed almost the same corridor the woodland once had. No one offered an explanation. No official report ever mentioned an animal. No evidence was considered sufficient. The investigation ended with 2 employees listed as missing. Their families never received answers. Several months later, Blackwater Container Terminal reopened. Additional cameras had been installed. Every former blind spot had been eliminated. Security procedures became stricter. More patrols, more cameras, more lighting. On the first night of full operations, a newly assigned surveillance operator began his shift. The departing supervisor stopped beside his desk. He pointed toward one monitor. "That's camera 27. The younger man nodded. "I've heard the stories." The supervisor gave a tired smile. "Most people have." He turned to leave, then stopped. "If anyone disappears, don't waste your time looking for a camera failure." The younger operator frowned. "What do you mean?" The supervisor looked toward the endless rows of containers beyond the windows. "The cameras always worked." He walked out of the room without saying another word. The new operator settled into his chair. The monitors showed forklifts, trucks, workers beginning another ordinary night. Then, on camera 27, one employee turned into the familiar storage lane. The operator casually shifted his attention to camera 28. The lane was empty. He waited. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. He immediately replayed camera 27. The worker reached the end of the frame, paused, as though looking at someone standing just beyond the containers, and walked out of view. Camera 28 never captured him. Not because it had failed, not because the signal had been interrupted, but because Whatever waited between those cameras had never needed the darkness. It had only needed someone willing to take one more step. The official investigation would later conclude that no equipment had malfunctioned that night. Every camera had recorded exactly what it was supposed to record. They simply couldn't record what happened between them.